Community Bible Church, it's so good to see you tonight. I have the privilege of bringing you some encouragement from the Word of God, and so looking forward to sharing tonight. In the midst of this prolonged shelter in place, you could feel like you're doing well just to be spending time in the Word, not losing your mind and not always fretting or worrying about the situation at hand. But God has an even bigger purpose for your life. He desires for you not just to not sin, but actually to have joy in the midst of every circumstance. So in this weekly word, we're going to talk about joy in the midst of our trials. And my prayer is that as we see Paul's great joy in the midst of his every circumstances and his call to the church in Philippi to have joy at all times, that our joy will once again, even now, be renewed. From Philippians chapter 1, we're going to see that one of the keys to joy is submitting to God's purposes. In any and every circumstance, we can rejoice because in any and every circumstance, God is at work and Christ can be proclaimed. The Apostle Paul was a man who faced trials in his life. As you read through his letters, it seems like the greater the trial he faced, the greater his joy. His life is a living illustration of severe affliction mingled with supreme joy. In our text in Philippians 1, what we're going to see is Paul is in circumstances that we couldn't fault him for being unhappy. He was in prison in Rome. He'd already spent 2 years confined without any crime on his part. He'd suffered a shipwreck and near death. Paul's circumstances were enough to make any man unhappy, and yet we find him abounding with joy. Paul's circumstances are not uncommon from ours today. And we can all respond to circumstances differently. Some respond with fear and anxiety. What's going to happen in the future? Who's going to take care of me? What if I don't have enough money for rent? Some can respond to difficulties with anger and resentment, anger at God or anger at others. God, why did you allow this to happen? Aren't you sovereign? Aren't you in control? Others respond to difficulties with anger and depression, sadness and depression. I just can't handle this. I don't even want to get out of bed and face my kids and my job and the next Zoom meeting. I just don't want to be alone anymore. We can all have thoughts like this. So what is it that's going to pull us out of our focus on self? What is it that allowed Paul to think differently in the midst of his imprisonment? And what is it that can help us in what may even feel like an imprisonment in our own homes? Well, one of the things that we can learn from Paul is that renewing our joy starts with renewing our minds. We must have a change in perspective, a perspective that is resigned to the sovereign plans and purposes of a good God. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't appeal at injustices that we see amongst us, but what we're going to see in Philippians is that Paul could rejoice in any and every situation because he saw that God's purposes of Christ being proclaimed could happen at any point and through any means. And that brought him joy. Philippians chapter 1, verse 12. It says here, "Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel." Paul introduces this letter by praying for them. And then the first thing that he tells them is that prison advances the gospel. Very counterintuitive, isn't it? Philippians, things don't need to go well for the gospel to progress. Well, how does prison advance the gospel? Look at verse 13. He says, "So that my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else." It sounds like a bad advertisement. Our main spokesman has been sent to jail. It doesn't really look like a very powerful God. And it may not appear very strategic for the pastor of a thriving ministry to pass away suddenly, or for a worldwide pandemic to happen. But have you met our God? Our God has a track record of taking situations that appeared dim and shining forth his great glory. Paul wanted the Philippians to know that actually it's a good thing that I'm in prison. And so should you. Paul's living out the theology of God's sovereignty and providence right before their eyes. He knew about Job. He knew the story of Joshua. He wrote Romans 8:28. And this wasn't just theology for him. He believed it, and it affected the way that he thought about the circumstances in his life. He knew that God is on his throne and that nothing could stop the gospel's progress. So rather than sulking, he joyfully kept his life's purpose in mind. How else does imprisonment advance the gospel? Look at verse 14. He says, and most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. Without fear. They were encouraged by Paul's proclamation in the midst of adversity. Prison, which you would expect would make people more fearful, it actually made them more bold. And I've heard this in accounts from many of you. This pandemic has made you recognize the brevity of life and the uncertainty of tomorrow. It's opened the door for more real conversations with believers and unbelievers alike. God is certainly at work, and this should bring you much joy. The gospel is still being proclaimed in nations through our live stream. More and more people are hearing the truth of the gospel. And this is what our confidence and hope is in, the living God. And that brought Paul great joy. Look at verse 18. He says, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. You know, as far as Paul is concerned, his circumstances are not the big picture. The gospel is the big picture. God's plan is the big picture. The spread of the kingdom is the big picture. And so when things don't seem to be going well, Paul knows that actually God is working for our good and for his glory, for the building of his kingdom. And this is hugely important for us to remember. Whatever our circumstances, however difficult, there's a larger purpose. The glory of God, the gospel of Christ, the exaltation of the living Son of God. You see, in order to renew our joy in the Lord, you must first start by renewing your mind about the Lord. He is sovereign and he is good. So he can and will take every situation in our lives and in the world and bring it for your good and his glory. You know, submission and joy don't really seem to mingle in our own minds. But this is part of what makes God God and us not. Our greatest good and joy is to submit to him. His will for us is to make much of him and to be conformed to his image. And trials are one of the ways that God conforms us to his image. One of the ways that our joy in the midst of the storm, it actually proclaims his majesty and his greatness. He can take a difficult situation and bring joy out of it. In chapter 4 and verse 4, Paul is beginning to wrap up his letter, and he tells the Philippians to rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. So I would encourage you, resolve, pray in this way, renew your mind to submit to God's plans with great joy. You know, it's our natural response to feel sorry for ourselves. It's natural for us to wonder, why me? Why this? Why so long? But we can choose to be joyful. We can choose to trust the good hand of our sovereign God, even when we can't see clearly. We can choose to believe that God indeed is working for good, even though the evidence may seem elusive. You know, it may not remove the trial, but it will enable us to live joyfully in spite of it.